Good day. The last day has demonstrated that as I've said many times, it is the crisis, the conflict in Ukraine, which is the defining conflict that is now affecting all the various positions that various states take in the international system. It is not the only source of events in the modern world. One event which is difficult to relate to it is the assassination of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan. Now, this is a tragedy for Shinzo Abe's family. It is also a tragedy for the people of Japan. I'm not going to discuss it further in this program. Alex Christoforou and I on the Duran have done a program dedicated to this issue, and I would ask anybody who wants our take on this terrible news to go and watch that program. For the rest, I'd say that obviously I have deep sympathy, as we all do, with the people of Japan and with Shinzo Abe's family at this moment of tragedy and crisis in the affairs of their country. Right, having said this, I think the right thing to do is, however, to return to the topic of the war in Ukraine, because we've now had some very important comments from President Putin of Russia, even as the military campaign in Ukraine continues. And I'm going to just say a few things about the state of the military campaign. Over the last few hours, we've been seeing lots of pictures and film of Russian forces rumbling in long columns towards the town of Siversk in northern Donetsk region. Siversk is now clearly the next target for the Russian offensive in Donbass. Now, I would say that there's been some really strange comments about the state of the war in parts of the media. I read in the Daily Telegraph that the Russians had not announced any new territorial gains over the previous 24 hours for the first time since the start of the military operation on the 24th of February. By the way, as far as I can see, that is simply not true. The Russians have announced the capture of various settlements, but I'm not going to devote time and energy to going into the details of this. There are other people like the Military Summary Channel who do that sort of thing far better than I would ever do. And there's also been a rather curious speech by President Zelensky in which he said that the artillery systems, the weapon systems that the West is providing have for the first time started to have an effect for Ukraine. Again, just days after the fall of Lysychansk, I can see absolutely no evidence for that at all. As a matter of fact, after their claim a few days ago that they had destroyed 2 HIMARS systems, the Russians have now made further claims that they have destroyed 2 Harpoon systems provided to Ukraine by Great Britain near Odessa. Now, I would say that on the HIMARS issue, the Ukrainians deny that the Russians did destroy 2 HIMARS systems, 2 of the HIMARS systems supplied to them by the United States. I said in my previous video, in my video where I discussed that report, that there'd been internet chatter before the destruction of these systems, which spoke about their destruction, which, whilst not corroborative in itself, did seem to me to corroborate the official Russian account. I have to also say that there's now been a successful, an apparently successful, geolocation of the place where these 2 HIMARS systems are supposed to have been destroyed. Somebody's done all the work to try and find out where the film of the Russian strike, where that is located, and it does seem to be a location where it would be plausible to expect that 2 HIMARS systems might be based. Now, I have to stress again, obviously this is information coming from the different sides, but for the sake of my, in order to give my own view, my own take is probably that these 2 systems were indeed destroyed, as the Russians say. The Ukrainians, for one thing, have a very powerful interest in denying the destruction of these HIMARS systems, given the way in which they've been unwisely talked up by Ukraine as some sort of game-changing wonder weapon, which they quite clearly aren't. Elsewhere, by the way, there's also been a report that a Russian air defense has been able to intercept and destroy in flight some rockets or missiles launched by this HIMARS system. Now, as far as I know, this is the first time this has happened, and it would suggest that the Russian air defense is now getting enough information about the aerial performance of these systems to be able to work out countermeasures. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that topic. I'm not an expert, and others who want to look into it are welcome to do so. But overall, it seems to me that we're now at that point in every battle, which I've discussed previously. The Russians, having captured the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation, having cleared Lugansk region of Ukrainian forces, are now doing what they always do. They're assembling their forces, they're assembling their artillery before they attack the next target, which is Siversk. And that's what explains this, all these pictures of all these rumbling convoys of Russian vehicles and tanks and armored cars and artillery systems, which we see trundling towards the west, towards Siversk. Now, there's also been reports that the Ukrainians have also concentrated large forces to defend Siversk, a fact which, by the way, points to the importance that the Ukrainians attach to the defense of this town. And there's some suggestions that there's up to 20,000 Ukrainian troops located in and around Siversk trying to defend this town from Russian attack. And the Military Summary Channel has done a really good job of identifying each and every Ukrainian formation which has been committed to the defense of Siversk. And the opinion of the Military Summary Channel is that this does indeed amount to a force of something like 20,000, which seems a very large number of troops to try to devote to the defense of this particular town. Now, 2 things stood out for me from this discussion by the Military Summary Channel, which is the impression I got. I mean, I may be wrong here, but the impression I got is that once again, Ukraine has drawn on its reserves, drawn on the reserves of some of its best troops, and is deploying them to the front line to try to hold back the Russian offensive. In other words, they're still not doing that which various people have suggested, including, it seems, increasing numbers of people in Ukraine have been suggesting that they should do, which is pull back, consolidate, build up their reserves. Instead, airborne troops, mechanized infantry, forces that arguably represent some of the best units of the Ukrainian military are once again being thrown into the front line in order to try to hold back the Russians. And what that suggests to me is that once again the Ukrainians are going for broke. They seem to hope that if they can hold back the Russians around Siversk, somehow this will work to their political or military advantage I don't understand the logic, at least the military logic. I've discussed this many times, but it seems that that's still what the Ukrainians are determined to do. And that isn't just, by the way, in Siversk, it's true elsewhere in Donbass. It's also true in and around Odessa, Nikolaev, that part of the world. The Ukrainians continue to concentrate their best and best equipped troops to try to hold back the Russians. In fact, there's even been some suggestions, one, for example, by Jacob Dreisen, that they're actually committed the remaining reserves of good, well-trained troops to this particular battle. If they lose this battle, if the troops in Donbass are defeated, if they're encircled and destroyed, that's it. Apart from the forces that are positioned in and around Odessa, all the best troops in the Ukrainian army will have been killed, captured, wounded, destroyed in some form. So this does give the impression of a Ukraine that's now going for broke. And that does seem to me an alarming and disturbing thing. Now, the Russians have not captured Siversk. There were some suggestions they'd capture it by Thursday. I never personally thought that was likely. They're doing instead what they always do. They assemble their forces, they bring out their artillery, they position their forces around the town, they first launch massive artillery attacks on the Ukrainians. They cut off the roads, they envelop this town, and then they advance and capture it. I described some days ago in another video the pattern of the war. The Russians launched massive artillery strikes. Only then, when the Ukrainian defenses have started to break down, do they commit their infantry and their other tank forces, to the extent that these tank forces are deployed at all. Once the infantry have stormed these positions, the Russians consolidate. Then they advance to the next target, the next town that they want to capture, and the process repeats itself and will go on repeating itself until the entirety of Donbass has been cleared. And the Russians are just, once again, following this incremental, methodical approach in Donbass. And they're doing it now with Siversk. Probably after Siversk, it will be Bakhmut. After Bakhmut, it will be Slavyansk. And then there'll be the final battle, presumably from Kramatorsk, always assuming, of course, that the Ukrainians don't finally accept the logic either of retreat or of perhaps reopening peace negotiations and seeking a ceasefire. Anyway, that now brings me to Putin's comments. Now, these comments were made in the Kremlin, in the St. Catherine's Hall in the Kremlin, which in Soviet times, by the way, was named the Sverdlov Hall after a Soviet politician. And as I discussed months ago, when Putin met with the heads of the Security Council, the Russian Security Council, and they made the decision, they discussed, and then Putin made the decision to recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The St. Catherine's Hall, in the time of Lenin and Stalin, was the place where the Soviet Central Committee used to meet. And of course, was, in other words, at that time, in the sort of peak years of the Soviet Union, Russia's major debating center. Now, it's been reconstituted to look as it did before the Soviet Revolution, but it's again being used by Putin and the Russian government as a debating chamber, this time bringing together all the heads of Russia's political parties. And I was interested to see, very struck to see, that the leading role, apart from Putin himself, was played by Gennady Zyuganov, who is the head of Russia's Communist Party. And Zyuganov actually said over the course of this meeting that for the first time, that since Putin became president of Russia, he and Zyuganov on vital issues relating to Russia, in other words, the military operation in Ukraine, that Putin and Zyuganov, according to Zyuganov's view, are talking from the same page. And given that the Communist Party is the second most popular party in Russia, and in terms of its organization and membership, perhaps even the biggest party in Russia, I found it somewhat suggestive and symbolic that all these meetings took place here in the Catherine Hall, where the former Soviet Central Committee used to meet. Again, like many other things that have floated to the surface over the course of this military operation in Ukraine, you see references back to Soviet symbolism, to the sort of heroic period of the Soviet Union, its resistance to Germany, and of course the war that took place between 1941 and 1945, what the Russians refer to as the Great Patriotic War. Anyway, just putting that little introduction to one side. Putin obviously opened with his speech, and he made these comments which have been widely reported in the Western media, but which, in my opinion, have been given the wrong emphasis. Now, it was a longish speech, not one of his longest, but it was fairly extensive comments that he made. But these are the two paragraphs. I'm now taking this from the Kremlin website. These are the two paragraphs which, in terms of Ukraine and the military operation, stand out for me. He said this: "Today we hear that they, that's to say the West, want to defeat us on the battlefield. Well, what can I say? Let them try. We have already heard a lot about the West wanting to fight us to the last Ukrainian. This is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, but that seems to be where it is going. But everyone should know that by and large, we have not started anything in earnest yet. At the same time, we are not rejecting peace talks, but those who are rejecting them should know that the longer it goes on, the harder it will be for them to negotiate with us." Now, it is that last sentence which, to my mind, is the important one. Let me repeat it again. We are not rejecting peace talks, but those who are rejecting them should know that the longer it goes on, the harder it will be for them to negotiate with us. As of this moment in time, Ukraine continues to insist that it will not negotiate with Russia, that its objective is victory, a victory defined in terms of reconquest of all Ukrainian territory, and the objective being to restore all Ukrainian territory lost to Russia since 2014, including Crimea and, of course, Donbass. And Western governments have been, in general, somewhat supportive of this. President Biden, in an op-ed he wrote for the New York Times, did concede the eventuality of negotiations, but he spoke about the need to put Ukraine in a stronger position to negotiate with Russia than it is in at the moment. And the suggestion was that more Western weapon systems supplied to Ukraine would somehow balance out Russia's overwhelming advantage on the battlefield. What Putin is saying in these words is that you can't defeat us in Ukraine. We're far from having used all the potential, all the force that is available to us. And that's what he meant by those words. We have not started anything in earnest yet. We've only used a fractional part of our military power. We can go far further than we have been going at the moment. And if you escalate, we not only can match your escalation, we can exceed it. Victory for us ultimately is inevitable. And in fact, earlier in his comments, he said that the Russians had in effect been winning the war in Ukraine literally from the first day. This is, of course, contrary to the Western narrative that Ukraine won some great battle around Kiev, but this is what Putin is saying, that the Russians have actually been succeeding. They've been winning in this war from the first day, and any Western force that is dedicated by the West, any new weapon systems that are sent by the West to Ukraine, the Russians have the means necessary not only to match them, but to exceed them. So this is delusional. But then, of course, he makes this utterly key point. We are not rejecting peace talks, but those who are rejecting them should know that the longer it goes on, the harder it will be for them to negotiate with us. This is precisely the point I have been consistently making. It is a fundamental, a dangerous fallacy to think that time is on Ukraine's side, to think that Western weapons supplies can somehow redress the balance, to think that some kind of Ukrainian counteroffensive in the late summer is going to change the dynamic of this war, that if you supply Ukraine with some more HIMARS systems or more javelins or some new weapon system, this will change things on the battlefields. On the contrary, the Russians prolonging the war will simply mean that the Russians will continue destroying Ukraine, killing more Ukrainians, what Putin said would be a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, destroying more of Ukraine's army, and capturing more and more of Ukraine's territory. And as I have also repeatedly said, the longer this goes on, the weaker Ukraine becomes, because it's losing territory, losing population, losing economic resources. It's already lost a great part of its industrial base, a large part of its agricultural regions, around 20% of its territory, its pre-war territory, of its territory, has now been captured by the Russians, and it's likely before long to lose even more. Siversk, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Donetsk. The more it loses, the less interested the Russians will ultimately be in negotiations. The Russians the point will eventually be reached where Ukraine, having suffered so many losses of territory, losses of industry, losses of agriculture, losses of troops, losses of equipment, the Russians will say, what is the point of negotiating with Ukraine anymore? The Ukrainians show no desire to reach some kind of satisfactory peace with us. We're winning the war. We're acquiring more and more of Ukraine's territory. The point has now come where we can simply dictate the terms of peace. And those terms may be such that they allow no room or space for an independent Ukraine at all. Now, to my knowledge, apart from myself, the only other Western commentator who's been saying this is Gordon Hahn. I discussed a few days ago an article he's been writing in which he says that this constant attempt to talk up Ukraine's prospects, this talk about leading Ukraine to victory, or is not going to achieve a better position for Ukraine in negotiations. What it is more likely to do is to completely destroy Ukraine, putting its very existence as an independent state in jeopardy. And that is what Putin in this speech is now explicitly warning about. He's not said this up to now, but he's now saying this. He's using careful language. He doesn't want to say that, eventually the time will come when Ukraine is going to be destroyed, but he's saying it pretty clearly nonetheless. The longer it goes on, the harder it will be to negotiate with us. Now, I hope eventually that this is understood. Now, this comments of mine at this point have been given particular urgency by an article which has appeared in Foreign Policy magazine, written by Barry R. Posen, and I want once again to thank the historian Jeff Roberts for alerting me to this article. Now, Foreign Affairs, I should say, is one of the leading publications on foreign policy in the United States. It's to a great extent the establishment magazine. It's the place where the most heavyweight articles about foreign policy tend to get published. And its title is Ukraine's Implausible Theories of Victory. And it goes on to say that the fantasy, it's subtitled The Fantasy of Russian Defeat and the Case for Diplomacy. And the writer, Mr. Barry R. Posen, writes a very good piece explaining why Russia cannot be defeated in Ukraine, that there is no prospect of Ukraine reversing the territorial gains that Russia has achieved. But this is my major concern about this article. He urges negotiations, he urges that some sort of compromise be sought through diplomacy with Russia. He urges diplomatic engagement with Russia, because the alternative that he is suggesting is that instead the war will reach some kind of an impasse, it will hit at some point some kind of stalemate, and this will be a disaster for the West, and it will be a disaster for Ukraine. Well, as you will realise, I agree with this up to a point. I also agree that re-engagement with Russia is essential, that the restart of diplomacy is essential. But I think Mr. Posen is understating, if anything, the dangers. The worst possible outcome for Ukraine and for the West is not some bloody impasse, some stalemate that goes on for a long time, bleeding Ukraine, to some extent weakening Russia, but bleeding Ukraine and prolonging the agony for the world economy as a result of this economic sanctions war. The worst outcome, but also, it seems to me, by far the most likely outcome, if this war is continued, is not a stalemate. It is a Ukrainian defeat. An outright, total, complete, comprehensive Ukrainian defeat. Now, if an impasse, a stalemate of the kind that Mr. Posen is talking about, is a disaster, what would that defeat be? A catastrophe? At the very least, it would be a disastrous debacle. Now, I read this article by Mr. Poulsen carefully. I'm not going to quote from it because it's behind a paywall, and I think that would be inappropriate to do. But reading the article carefully and reading all the reasons Mr. Poulsen outlines why Russia cannot be defeated in Ukraine, I came away with a clear impression that Mr. Poulsen actually privately also thinks that if the war is prolonged too far, Ukraine will not succeed in achieving some kind of impasse with Russia. Rather, much more likely, Ukraine will be comprehensively defeated and will lose and will suffer total capitulation. Now, I say that because of the details of the article, but I noticed that one particular point that Mr. Poulsen makes, for example, is that an insurgency in Ukraine would be an extremely bad idea. And why talk about an insurgency if there is no prospect, if he doesn't think that a Ukrainian defeat, a total Ukrainian defeat is likely? Well, all I would say is, if Mr. Poulsen does think that a Ukrainian defeat is a real possibility, and in my opinion, a likelihood, then I think his article, his arguments, would gain much greater force if he straightforwardly said so. My worry, my concern with articles of this kind is that by suggesting that the worst outcome is some sort of bloody stalemate or impasse, and the most likely outcome is some sort of bloody stalemate or impasse, that it's giving Western leaders the idea that if they go on sending more and more arms to Ukraine, they don't have to make any fundamental compromises, because from a political point of view, a impasse, a stalemate is an easier sell to Western publics than a total and complete disaster on the one hand, obviously, or a retreat into some sort of negotiated settlement with the Russians on the other. The last might be difficult to justify and explain away after all that's been said about how wicked the Russians are and how Ukraine needs to be supported. So accept all the price and all the costs, because after all, a stalemate is only a stalemate. It's not a defeat, and you can walk away from it. And even if Ukraine is crippled as a result, and even if there are severe economic consequences, well, at least you save face. Far better to say it straightforwardly, that it's not going to happen like that. Far more likely, as Putin is saying, there will be a comprehensive Ukrainian defeat. The Russians will dictate terms, and you will not be able to save face, because what you will end up is not a stalemate, but an undisguised, unequivocal debacle. Well, anyway, that's where we are. We see the Russians pressing on with their military campaign, with their military offensive, looking to pursue that offensive until victory, rejecting and reminding, in Putin's case, reminding people that anybody who rejects negotiations with them is not putting themselves in a stronger position in future negotiations. They're putting themselves in a weaker negotiating position in future negotiations. They may be, in fact, putting themselves in a position where the Russians no longer see any point in negotiating with them at all. Putin has given that warning, and the sooner it is heeded, the better. Now, there have been certain other developments which suggest to me that there is a strong need to start thinking seriously about this. I mean, we're getting all kinds of words now about the sort of things that need to be done in the West to try to get out of this hole, economic hole, that the West has got itself into. We're talking about the Germans. We hear now that there's actual plans to limit schools, to limit the time schools are open, because of potential energy shortages. There's apparently already plans to do that, all of which suggests a country descending rapidly into crisis. The Germans are still apparently trying to get Lithuania to relent on the blockade of Kaliningrad. There's been talk that the EU Commission has prepared some kind of statement. Well, I haven't seen any sign of that. Maybe it will come, maybe it won't. The Lithuanians are said to be unhappy. Well, we'll see whether it comes. We also hear that the Germans are now trying to persuade Canada to release the equipment that's been sanctioned so that Nord Stream 1 can be reopened. And in the meantime, more and more German politicians, mostly, it must be said, people on the political margins, but still the voices are there. They're coming forward and they're talking about reopening, or rather opening, Nord Stream 2 to get Germany out of this particular energy and economic crisis. I don't personally see that's going to happen, but so far we haven't even seen a final agreement on the release of this equipment by Canada to Russia so that they can get Nord Stream 1 working. It seems to me that the Germans are divided amongst themselves. They've no clear idea what to do. They're arguing with each other, even as they stuck with these policies of economic war of attrition. And note that it's the Germans who are having to consider plans for restricting schools, restricting times that schools are open. It's not the Russians. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians are now furious because the Turks have released a Russian ship with grain, and that grain is apparently, that ship is now apparently heading to the East African coast, where that grain will be supplied to Africa. And the Ukrainians are furious about this. They previously and wrongly said that this Russian ship had been detained by Turkey, and of course it's at Ukraine's request, and it's turned out to be wrong. Now, these are all important events in themselves, but they again point to the problems that this economic war of attrition is causing. And if we have these problems in the economic war of attrition, if we have these problems in the battlefield, problems for Ukraine, then we need to start these negotiations urgently so that we can start to resolve them, so that we can preserve Ukraine and we can preserve, or at least try to restore, some functionality to the Western economies, which are probably by now definitely in recession. Well, no sign of that at the moment. As I said, I talked about how the Germans haven't been able to get their act together, either about the Lithuanian blockade of Kaliningrad. I mean, we haven't had what I would have thought the situation obviously calls for, a straightforward statement from Chancellor Scholz saying that the Lithuanians acted alone, that they didn't consult Germany, that this is a huge mistake, that Germany does not support Lithuania in this, that the Lithuanians have acted completely inappropriately, and that if Lithuania persists with this, it needs to understand that it faces strong opposition from Germany, and that Germany will make its decisions in the European Council and in the Commission and in the Parliament and elsewhere with respect to Lithuania, taking into account the the sort of steps that Lithuania has taken with this blockade of Kaliningrad. We've not had that strong statement from Scholz, and one wonders whether he's even able, given the divisions in his government, to make those statements. And nor have we had a straightforward decision about this piece of machinery which the Russians say is needed to get Nord Stream 2 up and running again. And again, why not a simple statement from Germany to Canada that this is an impossible position. It's not, Germany doesn't acknowledge or recognize these Canadian sanctions, that they're not concerned that this is an issue. Germany has already taken great steps, made great sacrifices on behalf of Ukraine. It's not prepared to make any further ones. Germany has its own national interests which must be protected as winter advances, and in the circumstances they expect Canada to release this equipment to Germany. And again, if that doesn't happen, Germany will have to make its own decisions, not just with respect to Ukraine, but with respect to Canada too. That kind of strong statement, if the Canadians are still reluctant to release this equipment, would have an effect in Canada. And of course, if the Germans said that if this equipment is not released, they will open Nord Stream 2, well, believe me, that equipment would be released. A strong German Chancellor, and Adenauer, might once have done that. So, weakness on the part of Germany, and still at the G20 meeting in Jakarta, the foreign ministers meeting in Jakarta, a refusal to talk to Lavrov. We've had this extraordinary affair where instead of talking to Lavrov, instead of even meeting with him, we've had abuse directed at him, and a petty refusal to join him in a photo shoot. I mean, things that are childish and which just don't take things further forward in any useful way. I think Western leaders need to start thinking practically and realistically about this whole situation. And I think they need to start being straight with the Ukrainians, with the Biden administration, which is facing problems of its own, and of course with their own people, and start to make the proper decisions that need to be made. I think that it's time that Scholz and Macron and Draghi and all the others went to Kiev and straightforwardly said to Zelensky that Ukraine, further support for Ukraine is now dependent, it's now conditional on Ukraine immediately starting negotiations with the Russians. And I think that if there's criticism about that from the Biden administration, from people like Secretary Blinken and others, they need to be told in unequivocal terms that Germany, Europe, has to look to its own needs as well as its interests. Now, this German government clearly is not able to do that. And I come back to Germany because it's the key country that has to make that decision on behalf of Europe. If it makes that decision, then France, Italy and Spain undoubtedly will follow. So it ultimately depends on Germany. This German government is not going to make that decision. And I have to say it straightforwardly. If given that that is so, it seems to me that the only way forward is for this German government to be changed. Now, that's not something I lightly say. It's pretty bold for a commentator talking from London to tell Germans that they need to change their government. But look at the situation in Germany now. Look at the situation in Europe. Look at the situation in Ukraine. Do you really want to see a situation where Ukraine is comprehensively defeated and Ukraine perhaps disappears politically from the map? And do you really want to see a situation where the lights in Germany start to go out? Because that is what you're risking if you continue with the course that you have been maneuvered into following. Well, I have said it as plainly as I can. I don't know whether anyone in Germany is listening. I don't know whether Mr. Scholz is listening or whether he's even able to listen. But it seems to me that some realism is now imperative. We've been hearing wise words from people like Oscar Lafontaine on the left, Alice Weidel on the right. I think something has to be said now by more people from the mainstream, and I think that German industry and the German unions now need to be finally forthright about this matter. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again for more programs in this show. Remember, you can find us on Rumble and Locals. And of course, on Locals, we publish lots of exclusive content. I had a very wonderful live stream last Wednesday exclusively on Locals. I anticipate having another one next Wednesday at the same time, 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And you can find us on other platforms like Super U and ODYSEE. And of course, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And you can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, polo shirts, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those things. And of course, you can also support us by checking your subscription to this channel. And if you've liked this video, ticking the like button. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.